welcome everybody. And just to build on that introduction, the cultural and heritage sectors have been looking after collections for hundreds of years, from art and artifacts to historically important buildings and landscapes, even living collections of animals and plants. So it really is a vast space that we're covering here. And those collections contain essential knowledge about our societies and civilizations, and they have the potential to provide an evidence base to address some of the big challenges of our time. But how do we look after and share the information about these collections responsibly? How do we measure the social and economic value of these collections? And how do we secure the future of the sector? So we think it's the data that has the potential to unlock the answers to those questions. And the vital new-ish role for the sector is the stewardship of that data. So I'm delighted to be joined by this wonderful panel who we hope are going to bring quite different perspectives to this conversation. So I'll give really brief introductions to start with. China Williams from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. Now, Kew stewards an extraordinarily wide range of collections, the globally unique and growing collection of plant and fungal specimens, over 8 million in fact, DNA, seed banks, as well as collections including art, library, illustrations, economic botany, and historic buildings. You've even got a palace, I believe. And interestingly, because we're thinking about audiences as well, the site itself, Kew Gardens, ranks as #1 as the most visited paid attraction in Britain, which I only discovered, which was quite a surprise. And Kew is currently embarking on its digital revolution, so the digitisation of its collections, which we're going to hear a lot about. And welcome to Sarah Brown from the Collections Trust, which helps museums work with the information that connects collections and audiences. Their standards and advice are used around the world to make museum collections accessible. And now, objects and knowledge from UK museums will soon be easier to find and work with, thanks to an ambitious project to set up a new museum data service. And again, looking forward to hearing more about that from Sarah. And Anne Torreggiani from the Audience Agency, the UK charity for cultural participation and engagement. The Audience Agency is a specialist research organisation working with and for arts, museums and heritage organisations, campaigns for a more inclusive, people-centred approach, informed and inspired by data. And they have pioneered, amongst all the other work they do, pioneered a world-first data aggregation and analytics service known as Audience Finder, and Anne will be telling us more about that. So thank you all for being here today, and before we talk about open, which is the theme of the day, I'd like first to explore the stewardship of the data. So at the ODI, we recognise stewarding data as the foundational activity in the life cycle of data. So collecting, maintaining and sharing the data and making those important decisions about who has access to it, for what purposes and for whose benefit. So to each of you, I think there's a two-part sort of question to kick things off. Why does the stewardship of cultural data matter? And from what I've just said about our description of stewarding, does the role of the steward, or should the role of the steward, extend beyond collecting, maintaining and sharing? And so I'll go to you first, Sarah, with that one. Potluck.
Thanks, Jane. So the role of Collections Trust is we are a data steward in some ways. We work with a lot with museums, collections information, but we also support, advocate for lots of other data stewards. So I think what I've really been reflecting on in the sense of our role is the real importance of recognising the difference, I'm maybe going to get a bit philosophical, between ownership and stewardship, because I think ownership can sometimes lead to being a bit possessive, it can lead to barriers, gatekeeping, all of those sorts of different sort of negative power dynamics, whereas stewardship has more of that framework underpinning of ethics, it's more about collaboration, it's more about being open-minded as well as open with our data. So, for example, it was really interesting actually hearing the previous conversation. We know that collections data isn't neutral. It's the result of lots of choices. You mentioned decisions even in your introduction. What collections information are we recording? Who from? What are we excluding? All of those different decisions come into play. So the data as well is a product of all of those decisions. And with museum sector in particular, it's a product of a sector that isn't necessarily the most diverse sector at the moment. So we don't necessarily have that multiple perspectives that we need in our collections data. So I would broaden the role of a steward to that being collaborative so that the data can evolve beyond that sort of one story that's being told at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you. I like that difference between open and open-minded is a really interesting one. China, Kew's a historic institution stewarding collections spanning art and science and cultural heritage. So what does it mean to Kew's role now to be stewarding the data about that vast range of collections?
Yeah, well, as you said, our collections represent over 260 years of plant and fungal science, and they're also global, which I think is important as well. So particularly, again, you mentioned the difference between stewardship and ownership, but we have collections. We have an active collecting program at Kew as well. So collections are happening, right now, and obviously we hold a lot of the specimens and information under under agreements with the countries of origin. We do have a sort of very defined role under the National Heritage Act to care for the collection. So we do have a sort of a legal role. We have to care for collections. We have to keep them as a national reference collection, and importantly, make them available for study. I think that's where it's really, and let the public come in for knowledge and enjoyment. But I think that thing of making them available for study is also is a really key one here. And as you said, we're embarking on a huge digitisation project of our collections, and that will really kind of unlock that information where previously, you had to come to Kew to study that specimen information, and we have core information resources like medicinal plant name services and Plants of the World Online, which are used across the world. So obviously, one of our kind of our additional obligations is we need to make sure that the information is accurate and is reflecting the most up-to-date scientific analysis, and that's available and usable for all, and particularly those partners with which we've worked and whose material that we hold. I think that's an important point.
Thank you. And Anne, we've talked so far about the collections, but your work is involved on the data about the audiences.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how interesting all our different definitions of being a steward are. Maybe it's about on whose behalf are you stewarding is an interesting question, isn't it? So the Audience Agency, we are taking data from lots of cultural institutions, in fact about 1,500 altogether. We've taken little bits, sometimes little fragmented bits of information, essentially about audiences and about what those organisations do. So we're collecting audience information from ticketing systems, from surveys, which also means we're collecting data about events. We've got events and listings data. We've also got venue and place data. So all of these data sets are coming at us, and then there's a massive job of aggregation, organisation, anonymisation. There's a lot. So just being, in a sense, being a steward for me there's just quite a lot of work in the collecting and sort of transforming bit, right? So there's quite a lot of work there. But I think the steward part, so there is just a really practical job, and particularly in our sector, which is made up of a lot of, essentially, very few huge organisations, lots of very small organisations. So it is an important job to try and make sense of it. There's still many dark corners of the sector that we don't really even understand. We've just done a piece of work for the heritage sector, and we've realised that maybe it's about 4 times the size than English Heritage thinks it is, because they didn't have all the data for it. So things like that, right? So there is just a big chunk. The collecting, maintaining bit is important in itself. But I do think that when I think of being a steward, I think of us being the custodian of this really important understanding of who's engaging how on behalf of the sector. So for me, there is something, we have to go a bit beyond just maintaining it. We have to explain it. as I say, there's a lot of holes in it, and exactly how it gets used and how it gets interpreted, I feel enormously responsible that we don't let people misunderstand what what that data means when you put it together with other things. What can you conclude and what can't you? I think it's our job to be kind of a cook. I think we need to pull the plums out of the pudding sometimes. What's really important in here, what matters. If we look at things like, one of the things we spotted is this kind of real issue around ageing audiences for certain performing arts. Now, if you just look at the data as a passerby, policymaker or practitioner in a large theatre, you wouldn't notice what we can see. So that pulling the plum out of the pudding is very important. And I think there's something about ethics as well. It's like, what should we be using this data for? Is that all right or not? I think we also have, part of our stewardship is around that as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that as well, touch on that as well, that we need to think about this equity towards being able to access. So, at Kew we hold historic collections from most countries in the world, and so we also need to think really carefully about how those countries can access the data that we have, and think about almost like a sort of virtual repatriation in a way, but also using a broad range of tools like citizen science, but as well as the kind of machine learning, and think about how through our partnerships are we addressing that huge challenge of sort of equal access to data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's that's a really interesting point, that global aspect. When we think about the ethics and we think about what it is to be a responsible steward of data, what does that mean in different parts of the world? We can easily look at that through a very Western lens, but actually that can mean something very different in different parts of the world. So that's a really good point. So, thank you. So to move on to the topic of open, then, which we've already started to touch upon. We recognise that data exists on a spectrum, from closed to shared to open. Context is everything. Interested to know from your different contexts, and you've got multiple China at Kew, how you decide when open is right and the opportunities or challenges that presents. So again, I think you've probably got multiple contexts at Kew, so I'll go to you first, China.
Yeah, the director of Kew gave a talk the other day, and I heard him describing the digitisation project as in a sense liberating knowledge, which was is a really powerful thing, and it is, and as I said, making information available that previously you would have had to come to Kew. So there's a big push from funders, from our grants to make science research, scientific knowledge that we have at Kew open, and very, with that, but there are big challenges for us. So obviously there will be in some cases when we can't make open things like location data or something like that about a plant, longitude and latitude of where it is, and then we also, as I said, often have information relating to traditional knowledge around plants and use, and that is usually often laid out in agreements that we might have with the knowledge holders, so that there is this real balance between the positives of being open and also respecting and protecting the rights of knowledge holders in this era of open science. So I think that's maybe let the others speak, and then we can sort of come back to discussing, how we balance that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's huge, and yet you were talking the scale of all of this, and brings us on to a whole other issue around resources, which would be one for another conversation. But Sarah.
Yeah, I think the word balance that China used towards the end, I think, really resonates with me. So there's a lot of debate in the museum sector at the moment, particularly around decolonisation, around sort of harmful language, discriminatory content that might be part of historic record. So we wouldn't want to delete that information. And obviously being open with collections data brings with it opportunities for people to enhance, if we are being open-minded, to enhance our collections data, to identify bias, to sort of address gaps, all of that sort of stuff. But as you say, it needs to be done with that sort of ethical framework around it, so that we're also being aware of well-being when we're exposing people to that content, and also asking for their contributions and asking for them to be exposed and work with that data. So it's not just as simple as share. It's share with some context, share with some warnings, share with framework for well-being as well. I think is important.
Yeah, so I think I'm just thinking about it from so I think we talked a little bit about how our work relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. I was thinking a lot of our work is around, kind of making arts and culture much more accessible to a much broader public. I mean, that's essentially what we're about. It's like the benefits of lifelong learning and well-being, trying to improve the quality of access. But we're also thinking about institutional health and resilience around those things as well. So I think there's definitely, when I'm thinking about some of the issues around open, we're trying to balance, what is genuinely can be used in the public domain that is really useful, and particularly in the pursuit of better access for all, better visibility, lower prices, whatever those things may be, against the kind of, because we're an aggregator on behalf of lots of cultural organisations and institutions, they have, there are sensitivities for them about what we should and shouldn't reveal about their own progress. They need to be their own spokesperson. So I think we hold this space between, what our responsibility is to the wider sector and to the public against, all those organisations for whom we are a data steward in a sense as well. So it's this kind of interesting path between those two things that I think, ideally would be the questions around open. Interestingly, though, there is just some really pragmatic things. I mean, we just don't have vast resources at our fingertips to make genuinely open self-serve data available. So, when I talk about open, it's quite a compromised form of open. It's a kind of, we're really talking about responsible sharing and being very open to doing it, but so much contextualization required, so much hand-holding, the data sets aren't perfect. So I think the dream of open data, particularly for the complex interrelated data sets I'm talking about, we need a lot of resourcing just to make them as open as we'd really like them to be. So there is just some pragmatic issues beyond the straight ethical ones.
It keeps coming back to responsibility and
completely, choices about what's
So interestingly, you've also open at different degrees, but the thing that you've all talked about is collaboration and connectedness. So whether open and connected or not open and connected, it's that connectedness that seems to be the common denominator. Can you speak more of that with sort of examples and perhaps how that connectedness drives up the value and impact of the data, and perhaps towards sustainable development goals, as you've mentioned, Anne?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really useful about having open shared data and the understanding that comes with it is that we've thinking particularly about organisations being able to collaborate together, and I think particularly around we tend to be, we're quite successful at reaching certain parts of the population and less so at others. I think by creating a single conversation where we're all on the same page and we all understand, I'm thinking particularly about participation and engagement. How do we all understand where the real barriers are, what people are really saying? There are some regional things, there are some things to do with where you put the infrastructure and so on. So we can see that big picture now, but we can also share it with others. So I think that definitely having this is real evidence now. This is not people's opinions. I think you can change the conversation about what the urgent things we need to do together are. So, we've seen a lot of things. I mean, if I took the example of, there's a great programme that's been backed by the Arts Council of England, and for a long time, this was a very tiny pilot project, which was about about getting communities involved, making choices about their own programming, about programming of arts and culture in their area. And the work that we did with around, collecting all the data about that and seeing it as being very different from the kinds of things that the Arts Council usually funded, what we could see was hyper-local really, really mattered. Giving people choices about, giving people a voice in their own communities. We could see at a big macro level that was the single most successful intervention of public money we've ever seen in terms of democratising arts and culture. So without that kind of data, I don't think you would have had that. It's now become a huge programme. It's really well funded. It has changed probably the way that policy has gone in the arts in England, and that's as a result really about being able to sort of see that was making a difference on a big scale. But it's also, that's on the sort of like the macro level, but also at the micro level, it's kind of given people really tangible information about what they can and should do together as organisations. What difference can we make in our local community? So this having real evidence, not a bunch of assumptions and opinions. Particularly, I think, when you've got, in the participation space, lots of well-meaning ideas about what barriers really are. We need that evidence to change behaviours within the sector. So for me, it's as hands-on as that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Sarah?
I don't necessarily know what I would add to that. I think it's quite interesting. This probably doesn't answer your question, but just hearing your perspective on data about anonymising, about sort of evidence-based, that's actually quite different to collections data. We need attribution, we need a lot of transparency around where this information has come from in the first place in order for it to have impact and in order for it to have meaning. So it's quite interesting sort of hearing from the audience data side, the collections data, it's actually quite different, even though it's all very much the same.
Yeah.
I don't think that answers your question, though.
No, it's really interesting to hear that very, very different perspective, and also, the participation element that you talked of. We're embarking on a programme of work to do much more in-depth research around participatory approaches to data. So yeah, really interesting. In China, with the global, Kew has huge global connections.
I'm thinking again on the community level. We've had a couple of really positive projects in the Useful Plant project in Mexico and Mozambique, very much working from the community led base level to identify important plant. What are the important plants in that small community, whether it be for food, health, whatever. And that the information about use and seeds from those plants are the kind of focus of those projects. And I think that's sort of the way to go, is that Kew's are obviously often not the primary recorder of that newly documented knowledge, but it's done on the community level and it's done in country. So that's kind of a different shift, and I think we're seeing that. I think there's a couple of examples from Spain. They've recently created a Spanish inventory of traditional knowledge, and an online platform as well where citizens can document that knowledge. And then on a bigger level, the Indian government have invested in a traditional knowledge digital library, which is very much to kind of protect knowledge and establish prior use, something that can be searched by patent offices, but also could be used. So I think that kind of bottom-up led, way of documenting that kind of more sensitive knowledge is the most sort of the best way to go, really.
Fantastic. Well, gosh, we could, and there's a whole range of other subjects we could cover here. We haven't even touched upon all the resourcing issues and the practicalities, but this, really strong themes coming through around the responsibility and the challenges around resources. Who is going to do, who needs to do this, and the challenge of connections and partnerships. So, thank you. I think we could keep talking, but we need to give some time for the audience to ask some questions. So would anybody like to ask a question? There is one at the back of the room. Should we take that one first? And then if you could just wait till the microphone comes to you. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Emma Caroon. I work at the Alan Turing Institute in the Open Infrastructure Programme. I'm very aware that collections are not just in big national museums and organisations. How can you, as these national large institutions, support these smaller museums and institutes from actually digitising their collections? Because I feel like there's such a huge wealth of other data out there. How can we start to bring those collections into the sort of national collections?
Absolutely. And Sarah, I know the Museum Data Service is addressing exactly that, isn't it? So would you like to take that one?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. And a lot of the museums that we work with day to day are the tiny volunteer museums, the sort of more medium size, as well as you say, those nationals. So the Museum Data Service, without getting technical, because I can't get technical, is really aiming to gather together and pool all of the information from, ideally all of the museums is the target over the next few years, whether they be tiny museums with an Excel spreadsheet, whether they be a museum with a really fancy database, in whatever form they have it, without them needing to process or edit that information in any way, which can then be used for, without making assumptions. We were talking before about making assumptions about use, but it would then be available for a researcher or for somebody with some sort of other project who wants to process it in the way that they need to and then sort of work with it. So that's the aim over the next few years. We're working with a few pilot museums at the moment just to troubleshoot in terms of, ingesting the data from all of these different formats, essentially. And we're also doing some consultation at the moment about what those different museums might need in terms of support. As you say, maybe they've got lots of little card catalogues that are handwritten that they need a bit of help with just typing up into a computer. It can be as simple as that. So that's the sort of support as well that, as a sector support organisation, we'll hopefully be working with them to support them on that, as well as the bigger infrastructure side of things. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, so I think this is amazing because I'm a trustee of Europeana, which is the big, the European-funded museum data aggregation service. It's we've just been relicensed for another 10-year license thing. But I think this question of how small museums, it's a massive uphill struggle to actually kind of do that really hands-on, the dirty work of just getting the information ready to be digitised. And I think it's just a really great model as a way of doing things. So I just wanted to say, big up Museum Data Service. That's great.
Yeah, I don't know about the museum well, but I do know that a couple of organisations, PlantNet, which is a UK network of botanic gardens, and then BGCI, which is the international version, they both have a lot of resources and training and support for digitising projects. So that's definitely something that would be worth looking at for maybe a botanic garden, or that might be connected. Some small botanic gardens have very small cultural heritage collections as well.
Thank you. We got time for your question, Emma? No. We haven't. Oh, okay.
Sorry. It could have been a very quick answer, actually, but maybe if I get time with any of you later, I'll take the opportunity to ask it. That's been fantastic.
Thank you.
So really illuminating discussion. Again, another one that could have gone on for a long time, but I'd like to thank Anne, to thank Sarah, Jane, and also, of course, China from Kew Gardens. Thank you so much for a great panel.